Welcome back, everyone. This is the Oracle Decodes, the Riddle of the Sphinx, from ancient Egypt to ancient Greece. We're going to start out looking again at some information we only briefly touched on from Wikipedia that came out of our part 2 of Decoding of Ancient Egypt, where we looked a lot at the ancient Egyptian god Horus. And we learned there that Horus was thought to be the inspiration for the Sphinx at Giza that we're getting into decoding here in this piece. So if you haven't seen at least parts 1 and 2 of our Decodings of Ancient Egypt, I recommend that you take a look at those before coming back here, as this will be much clearer as you go forward here. So as we learned in part 2, Horus became the first quote-unquote national god of ancient Egypt, and he was thought to be, like I said, the inspiration for the Sphinx at Giza. And we learned in the second piece that Horus is usually depicted as a falcon-headed god, so the man's body with a falcon's head. But he was also depicted many times as a creature with a lion's body and a hawk's or a falcon's head and wings. Something exactly like you see here on a wall relief of Horus as this Sphinx-like creature. So that's our first tie of Horus to the Sphinx. The information we're going to look at for the rest of the video and pull pieces out from it all come from the same website. And the author sets out here by trying to ask the question of whether the Sphinx from ancient Egypt is tied to what shows up later in the story of the Riddle of the Sphinx in ancient Greece. And many scholars have had trouble in answering this question because at the root of it is the problem that the scholars haven't correctly decoded what the Sphinx actually is. Something that we will solve by the end of this video, and something you will be able to do. So the mainstream story about the ancient Egyptian Sphinx at Giza is that it's thought to have been carved around 2500 BC. The Sphinx is thought to have been the project of the pharaoh at the time, Khafre, and it's Khafre's face that is thought to be on the Great Sphinx itself. Khafre was also thought to be behind the building of the second Great Pyramid of Giza. The Sphinx remains the oldest and largest stone monument in the world, and it faces due east. Now, the only purpose that scholars have come up with for the Great Sphinx is that it was meant to be a guardian for the 3 pyramids of Giza. But we're going to learn the purpose of the Sphinx is far more than that. Now, this website goes on to say that the lion is a symbol of immortality and specifically symbolizing the creator god Atum in ancient Egypt. And lions are found guarding places of entry and exit throughout ancient Egypt, something that also continued into ancient Greece. So the lion symbolism is obviously important, being that the lion is part of the Sphinx here that we're decoding. And remember from part 2, when we were decoding ancient Egypt, specifically the Eye of Ra and the Eye of Horus, taken collectively, they're called the Eyes of Wadjat, we saw another connection with this lion symbolism. Before they were known to be the Eyes of Ra and the Eye of Horus, remember we learned that specifically what became the Eye of Ra was often associated with a lioness goddess. So she later on through time became syncretized and known as the lioness-headed goddess Sekhmet in ancient Egypt. So the Eye of Horus ties in again with this lion symbolism, another tie-in to the Great Sphinx. Further association of the Sphinx with Horus is made by noting that the pharaoh Khafre, in other artworks of him, he's depicted with Horus with spread wings behind his head. So we've got the builder of the Sphinx, and it's his face that supposedly appears on the Sphinx itself, also associated with Horus. Now we're going to get into the etymology of the word Sphinx. So this website goes on to say it's unknown where the word Sphinx actually comes from. it shows up in Greek for the first time in the 5th century BC. So that makes it unclear then what the ancient Egyptians actually called the Sphinx. Now an attempt is made to put forth a theory that the ancient Egyptians called the Sphinx Sheshonq, and Sphinx came out of the Greeks attempting to pronounce that. But another important thing to bring in here is what the word Sphinx is also associated, meaning in Greek, the word sphingo, to constrict, squeeze, or bind. We're going to get back to that in a second. Okay, so now we're going to bridge this information of the widespread appearance of sphinxes in Egypt, including feminine versions of it that continued into other cultures as well, into ancient Greece, where we're landing, where we're going to decode here the famous riddle of the Sphinx. Now, the website that we're looking at does a great job at taking us through how the story of the Sphinx in ancient Greece evolved and how it was syncretized. So, the first appearance of the Sphinx, it says here, was in literature in ancient Greece, in Homer. And it's there where we only get the details that the Sphinx is a chimera of some sort, a combination of a lion and dog perhaps, and was called Fix or Sphinx. Now, I said before, other scholars have attempted to connect the Greek word sphingo with sphinx. Sphingo meaning to constrict, squeeze, or bind in Greek. Now, another detail to note here is that in older tellings of stories about the Sphinx or this chimera creature was that she strangled those who couldn't answer her riddle. And so putting those two things together, her name and the way that she kills those who couldn't answer her riddle, makes sense. The story of the riddle of the Sphinx is traced by scholars back to the 5th century BC to Apollodorus, where the Sphinx is described as having, in those writings, the face of a woman, the body of a lion, and the wings of a bird. She sat on a mountain called Mount Phykion, guarding the entrance to Thebes from passerbys from the oracle at Delphi, and asked anyone wanting entrance into Thebes a riddle. If the wrong answer was given to her, the Sphinx would kill them. Many were killed by the Sphinx in the story, until one day Oedipus came along, who solved the Sphinx's riddle correctly, and after that would be king. Oedipus Rex, and many a stage play was written in his honor and enacted long after ancient Greece. Now, Oedipus may sound familiar to you as well if you've ever heard of Sigmund Freud's Oedipus complex. Now, this is part, at least a controversial part, I think still today, of Freud's overall psychoanalytic theory that would be, to decode Freud's psychoanalytic theory would be the subject of probably more than one video, but this is the myth that references Freud's Oedipus complex, where the riddle of the Sphinx comes from. So let's leave the Freud tie-in and get back to the riddle of the Sphinx and the basic story about it that evolved through ancient Greece. So after killing many who couldn't answer her riddle correctly, the Sphinx came upon Oedipus, who walked up to the guardian of Thebes, and the Sphinx posed her riddle to Oedipus, asking him, "What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening?" Oedipus answers her riddle by saying, "Man. As a baby in the beginning or morning of life, he crawls on all 4s. Then as a man walks on 2 legs, and at the evening of his life uses a cane to walk, appearing to walk on 3. At this answer, the Sphinx threw herself from the cliffs of Mount Phykion to her death, and Oedipus then later becomes king. Let's take some of these pieces of information that we've looked at and start out by decoding who the Sphinx really is for the first time. Another amazing discovery we could only have made with the help of the real oracle or the real all-seeing eye. So we're queuing up a screenshot from Stellarium again, taking a look at that special place in the sky where the north-south meridian line crosses the arc of the ecliptic. And And we're looking from that point down to the horizon of the Earth, from the perspective of someone looking up at this real oracle or real all-seeing eye from what we commonly call the Northern Hemisphere, right? Because that's where both the ancient Greek and ancient Egyptian cultures are located, geographically speaking. So we're taking a look at what's happening in the sky story during the first week of what we commonly call March at sunset, because that's where the Sphinx tells us to look. Now remember, in a previous piece, we already decoded what leap year is really all about. But notice as we're starting here, we're looking at the day after leap day this year. So the last day of February going into what we commonly call the first week of March. Now, although leap year is a different phenomenon that we're looking at here, they are connected, as you'll see. And the Sphinx is pointing the way. So what we find going into the first week of what we commonly call March, the day after leap day, we find the constellation of Leo the Lion, fully risen. All the stars of the constellation of Leo, all above the eastern horizon of the Earth for the first time of the year at sunset. So these are going to be the constellations first visible when the lights go down, right? Along with the constellations of Orion and Auriga at that special crossing point of the north-south meridian line and the arc of the ecliptic. And it's also the constellations of Cetus the Whale and Pisces, as they're known nowadays, just above the western horizon of the Earth, ready to make their descent. So when you squeeze this combination of constellations together, you can see the Sphinx. Just like the word Sphinx derives its meaning from to squeeze or to bind together. It's even found in her name. This is symbolizing this exact alignment that you're looking at in the sky story. The Sphinx is encoding this specific alignment at this specific time of the year. The lion, or Leo, is the lion part of the Sphinx, obviously. The man who becomes Pharaoh in ancient Egypt and in later time and culture becomes king in ancient Greece is Orion and Auriga, the crown above Orion's head. That's the man part of the Sphinx. The bird part of the Sphinx is the combination of Cetus and Pisces. And we've already decoded from part 2 of our ancient Egypt decodings that the combination of Cetus and Pisces is the baby Horus from ancient Egypt. Now you're clearly looking at what are the real origins of the Great Sphinx in Egypt. And for the very first time, you can now decode the real riddle of it that continued on into the ancient Greek culture. Now, many times, these sphinxes are chimera creatures that are also given body parts of a bull in some cases. And this is going to make a lot more sense when you see that certain storytellers wanted to include the constellation of Taurus the bull as well sometimes, as you can see that its position is also at the top of that special crossing point of the north-south meridian line in the arc of the ecliptic. So it makes sense why sometimes bull parts are found in sphinxes. So now that we know what the Sphinx is actually meant to encode, not only that it's found in her eventually being given her name, the Sphinx, meaning in Greek to squeeze or bind together, it's also encoding a specific alignment, this specific sky story, at this particular time of the year. And that's where we're going next, so you can see this clearer. So we're going to go forward to the following day at sunset to the 2nd of March, as we commonly call it. And we expect to see exactly what we do here. All the constellations that we're tracking slightly more westward on their journey when compared to the previous sunset the day before. So looking again to the next day at sunset, what we commonly call March 3rd of 2020, we're watching what we're collectively calling the Sphinx. All of these constellations appear even more slightly westward than they were the sunset before. So we're going to jump ahead 3 more days, just for the sake of time. We're to the 6th of March, as it's commonly called, and the pattern's holding true, as you can see. What we're collectively tracking is the Sphinx is continuing to move more westward on her journey. So we're arriving here at the end of the first week of March, what we commonly call the 7th of March. Note all the locations here of what we're tracking, what we're collectively calling the Sphinx, and the location of the sun. So we've seen a series of screenshots throughout the first week of March that show this progressive movement, everything going a little bit more toward the west, day over day, or sunset over sunset. So we'd expect that the same pattern will hold, right? The sun going down as the sky around it gets darker. But when we go forward to what we commonly call March 8th, just the next day at the same time, we see evidence of what we've discovered and talked about before in a few of our other videos, starting with the Oracle Eyes, the Timeline Pirates, where we, at that point, brought forward the discovery that the real Oracle, or the real all-seeing eye, winks. Now remember, this wink phenomenon is not anything that any of us are taught about with this given heliocentric model of the universe that we're taught about in school. We are not ever taught that in one day, everything that we're tracking in the sky story jumps back the equivalent of an entire hour from where it should be, with this pattern that should continue, right, of this incremental, more westward sunset after sunset journey that we normally expect out of the luminaries when we're watching them. We're going to get even deeper into this wink phenomenon again, along with its mirrored version, the wink that the real Oracle or the all-seeing eye does, but in reverse, in the fall. But that's going to be the focus of another video. What we're learning here in this piece is that for the first time we can decode the real purpose of the Sphinx and its origins in ancient Egypt. It's encoding for the specific time of year to watch for the real Oracle to wink. The Sphinx and the myth surrounding it, and how it's been syncretized over time and throughout various cultures, from ancient Egypt to ancient Greece, all of these Sphinx creatures are guarding the same thing. They're hiding the knowledge they're guarding right in plain sight within themselves. The knowledge of the constellations they represent in the sky story and their location taken together in a specific alignment when they are guarding 3 very special crossing points in the sky. That would be above the eastern horizon of the earth, at the top of the mountain in many stories, as is in this one, the cross of the north-south meridian line in the arc of the ecliptic, and the western horizon of the earth. And the sphinxes are all pointing us to focus on what time of year we can watch the real Oracle or the real all-seeing eye wink. So as we end things in this piece, let's really decode what became known from the ancient Greek story of Oedipus as the riddle of the Sphinx. Oedipus becomes king after correctly solving the Sphinx's riddle, and this leads to the Sphinx committing suicide once her riddle was correctly solved, where she jumps off the cliff of the mountain that she sat upon. The riddle of the Sphinx, again, is this: what has but one voice, walks with 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? The riddle Oedipus solved by answering man is correct, but there's a little bit more to it than that, as we're about to, for the first time, fully decode. We're back to a screenshot of the sky story from the Northern Hemisphere viewer's perspective again, and we're looking on the morning of what we commonly call March 1st. Notice it's when you'll find the constellation of Cetus, as it's known nowadays. A constellation, by the way that it's shaped, has looked to many storytellers, even in the ancient past, to appear to them like a big baby in the sky. Well, this will correspond to the baby in Oedipus's answer that crawls on all fours in the morning of his life. Because as you can see, it's the morning you will find Cetus during this time of the year. During the daytime, at the exact same day, same time of the year, you can find the constellation tied to that big baby in the sky, known nowadays as Cetus, to the constellation we call now Orion. Orion is doing double duty here in this story. He's both the man who walks on two legs at the daytime of his life, and Orion is also Oedipus in this story, who later becomes king after solving the Sphinx's riddle. Now this corresponds again to Orion in combination with Auriga, the crown above Orion's, or in this story, Oedipus's head. Then when you progress to just a minute before midnight, same day, 1st of March, time of year that the Sphinx tells us to look at, and the riddle of the Sphinx is actually talking about, you'll find the constellation of Orion, or the man, starting to descend into the western horizon of the Earth, and from his angle he's making to the Earth's horizon, Orion appears to be using his bow as a cane, doesn't he? Walking on 3 legs in the evening. And now you know how to really correctly answer the riddle of the Sphinx. And this is where the Sphinx's story ends, at least in ancient Greece. Notice that at the top of the cross of the north-south meridian line in the arc of the ecliptic at the same time, you'll find the constellation of Leo, the lion, stretching back all the way to ancient Egypt, where she was the ferocious lioness-headed god that became Sekhmet. And we also learned in a previous decoding, this is associated with the eyes of Wadjat, or the eye of Ra and the eye of Horus, and associated with protection as well. Why is it that after Oedipus answers the Sphinx's riddle correctly, it's said that she throws herself from the cliffs, from the mountains upon which she sat? Well, it's because, as you can see, at this time, Leo is found at the top of the mountain. And when the next minute progresses to the following day, Leo will fall from the cliff on top of the mountain in which she sat and will die into the horizon of the earth. Solving the riddle of the Sphinx is made quite easy with the help of the real all-seeing eye, or the real oracle, and it's our hope that in the future we can continue to use this powerful discovery to solve many more ancient and modern-day riddles. I hope that at least in this piece we've helped to expand your knowledge and bridge that knowledge from ancient Egypt to ancient Greece in the process by solving correctly the riddle of the Sphinx. We'll end things here and pick it back up in our next decoding. Until then, be well.